All right, today is August 16, 2018. This is the meeting of the Kubernetes Storage Special Interest Group. As a reminder, this meeting is recorded and published on YouTube. If there's anything that you want to discuss today, please feel free to add it to the agenda document. The link is in the invite. And so first of all, we're going to go over the planning spreadsheet, which has all the items that we're working on for this quarter and get a status update on those. Then we're going to discuss any PRs that need attention, bugs that need attention, and any design reviews. So let's jump straight into it. First up is the spreadsheet. Let's get a status update for these items. First up is implementing the out-of-tree volume snapshot and restore controller. There's been a lot of good progress here. Jing or Shing, do you want to give an update?
Yeah, sure. So the PR on the snapshot controller is being reviewed, and we have been addressing the comments. The snapshot API PR got merged. We made additional small changes to the snapshot APIs after that. So those changes are still being reviewed. And there are some discussions regarding data source in PV, in the mailing list. And team suggested to use readiness gate feature to check if everything's ready for the PVC. We are investigating that option. And for now, we will remove data source from PV. So we won't make any changes to PV for now until we're done with our investigation.
Cool. Sounds good. Great progress there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hold on real quick. Just removing it from the PV and not the PVC for data source?
Right. To give a little bit of context on that, so initially we were talking about how do we detect the case where when you have a volume provision from a snapshot, but you're using an old external provisioner that doesn't understand data source from PVC, and it completely ignores that and provisions a volume without the data there. How do we detect that and alert the user to that case? And the second use case was, if I want to decouple the component that's going to be doing the provisioning of the volume from the component that's going to populate that volume, how do I do that? And the initial proposal that we came up with was, let's add data source not just to the PVC where you say, I want a new volume that is going to be populated with this data source, but also on the PV to indicate that the provisioner actually did it. And if the provisioner didn't do it, some other component could step in and actually do it and update that field on the PV. We talked to a few folks about this, and a few folks in this SIG, I think Ben and others, raised some concerns that marking the PV permanently with its initial starting data source is a little bit odd. And talking to Tim, he recommended we take a look at something called readiness gate that has been applied to the pod and soon the node objects. And the idea here is that in both of those objects, they have some sort of ready state, but they have external components that they depend on to help that object achieve that state. It's not just internal Kubernetes code. And so what they did is have a mechanism by which they could have a list of these external readiness checks, and the pod is not going to move into a ready state until all of those checks have been achieved. So in this case, you can imagine the PVC having a set of readiness checks, where one of the readiness checks is the data source that must populate this PVC. If we have something like that, then we don't need to modify the PV object. When a PVC is created, we could have something like an admission controller that looks at the data source and populates the appropriate readiness check fields, and then the PVC won't go into bound state until it is the bound phase until that readiness check has been satisfied by some component, whether it be the provisioner or some external populator.
I actually like that a lot because that's kind of what we were looking for, and that doesn't require a state change. That is what we were getting at. Does it have to prevent it from being bound, though? Even if you have this readiness gate, can you bind the PV?
So that's the thing. Like, ideally, we want to be able to allow some sort of binding where the populator itself could actually consume this volume. So the details of that need to be worked out and how we're going to achieve that, whether it's not getting it to bound, introducing a new state, introducing a new field to say it's ready to use or not. We need to think through that.
I'll look at this readiness gate and I'll include that in the populator proposal.
That would be great.
We can flesh it out then.
That would be great.
Thanks.
All right, thanks, Aaron. Next up is CSI entry block volume support to beta. I think we've decided with all the other work that we have going on for CSI and the limited resources we have, we're not going to push for this this quarter. It's going to remain in alpha this quarter, and all we're going to do is try and fix bugs for it. Vlad has identified a handful of bugs, and he's looking for folks on his team to help with that. If you're interested in this area, please reach out to Vlad, and we can help. You can help us fix bugs in this area. Vlad, is there anything else you want to add to that?
No, not too much. We've already started. I have somebody helping me,
Cool.
and we got working on a couple of those bugs. One is documentation, and the other one is we're gonna look into putting retries in a few places.
Cool.
To combat flapping.
Sounds good. Next up, the CSI drivers, we're going to skip over these. We're just going to get a status update at the end of the quarter. They're not going to be part of the core Kubernetes, so we'll just get a status update at the end of the quarter. CSI entry cluster plugin registration mechanism. I have a proposal out for this, and I'm working to generate the code while the proposal gets approved. This ended up being a CRD, not a entry component. We went and talked to SIG architecture, and their line is that there's no more entry core components. You have a very, 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 very high bar if you want to add anything entry. Even the things that were entry, if we were to do them again, things like pods and nodes, we would make them CRD. So everything is becoming a CRD. And this should be added as a CRD. So we're pursuing that. Like I said, the proposal is out. Please take a look at it, provide feedback, and we're going to get that in hopefully as soon as possible. I'm hoping to have some code that others can use by the end of this week, which is tomorrow. Skip external attach detach for non-attachable volumes. Jan has a proposal here which is dependent on the CSI cluster registry. Any updates on this or anything you want to add, Jan?
No, there are some rough edges about updating and downgrading Kubernetes, but the rest should be pretty straightforward.
Cool. So please take a look at that as well. The proposal's out there. Next up, we have replace volume reconstruction with Cubelet checkpoint. Ben and Vlad. Any progress on this quarter?
No, that's been a low priority for now, so there's nothing.
That makes sense. I'm actually going to push this down to the bottom. Oops. Okay. Next up, we have the CSI mount library. This is a lot of core util functions that are used in the core of Kubernetes that can be useful to CSI drivers. Travis, I believe, has been working on this. Last status update was that we agreed on an approach, and we're going to break package util mount into 2 pieces. And once that was complete, then there would be a second step to move the generic implementation out of Kubernetes. Any updates on this, Travis?
He wasn't able to join, but he sent me an update saying that he's continuing to work on that mount refactor. So there's progress being made there.
Cool.
I'm not sure exactly what's the state of it, but there's definitely progress being made.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks, Vlad. Next up is the Kubernetes device plugin integration to beta. This is a pretty large project. We've been working with the folks who on the device plugin team who implemented the Cubelet device plugin registration mechanism. The current status is they came up with a list of items that need to be done in order to move to beta. As far as code on the core is concerned, they have some lifecycle hook changes that they want to make, in particular how the volume plugin is unregistered. So if the Unix domain socket is deleted, we want to use that as a signal that the plugin should be unregistered from the kubelet. And that code is being implemented at the moment and is going to be reviewed by Sergey and Vlad. In addition to that, we want to add end-to-end tests for CSI to exercise this code path. That's going to be on our team to do. And then we're also looking into how to integrate with this more cleanly. So today, there is a sidecar container called the Driver Registrar, and its responsibility is basically updating the node object with any labels that are required by the driver, including things like the node name and potentially topology keys and things like that. But with this change, that logic moves into the kubelet, and the kubelet updates the node object, which is what we want for security reasons. But there is a registration API, a gRPC proto that was introduced for kubelet registration that is not part of the CSI spec. And so if you have a CSI compatible driver that is agnostic to Kubernetes, it has not implemented this new gRPC service for registration, so we had to implement that logic inside the driver registrar. So the driver registrar now also exposes a service which is only responsible for registering the driver with kubelet. The challenge now is that the driver is exposing its service on a Unix domain socket, and the driver registrar is exposing another service on a Unix domain socket. And the way that it works is that both of them expose their Unix domain sockets onto the host. The Unix domain socket dropped by the driver registrar is the one used for registration. And part of the registration, driver registrar actually returns what the path to the driver's Unix domain socket is. That whole thing works. But even as I describe it, it's fairly complicated. And if you're a new driver author, it's pretty easy to get lost. So one of the things that we were considering this quarter was trying to simplify that and what we could do. One proposal we had was ideally we'd like to just eliminate one of the Unix domain sockets and only have a single Unix domain socket. In order to achieve that, either we need to push this CSI registration stuff, or sorry, driver registration or plugin registration stuff into CSI, which is difficult to do, or we have to proxy any calls for the driver through the driver registrar. So Vlad and Sergey started looking at a potential proxy solution, but that is going to introduce, one more point of failure and potentially more latency. So we may not want to do that, and we may end up just adding a lot of documentation around how to set this up, because essentially it's a one-time pain for the driver author. Once they have their YAML file set up correctly, it's not exposed to the end user. It's a one-time setup pain. So that is continuing to be investigated. Sergey or Vlad, do you want to add anything to that?
No, no, I think that pretty much sums it up. Hopefully, if time allows, we'll be able to look at a proxy solution. If not, definitely the documentation will be what we lean toward.
Cool. Next up is preparing CSI for GA in Q4. So this is something that we really, really want to do. I think for the most part, if we land the items that we have this quarter, we're in good shape. So we need to make sure we do that. Next up is Pluggable end-to-end test framework. Patrick was working on this. Patrick, are you on the call by any chance? Doesn't look like he is, so we're going to skip over the status update on that. Local PV health monitoring. Nick Wren and Michelle were working on this. I know Nick is usually not available at this time. Michelle, do you happen to have an update on this?
Yeah, I haven't been able to look at this at all.
Okay. Is anybody else in the call interested in health monitoring and able to look at the proposal? Okay. Hopefully, as we approach the end of the quarter, we'll have a little bit more time, which is unlikely. But if anybody has some bandwidth, please take a look at this proposal and provide feedback. Next up is Kubernetes Conformance and CSI Conformance. Michelle, do you want to talk about these?
Sure. I think we're making some slow progress in terms of how the Kubernetes Conformance plan is going to look like. I actually have an item on the agenda to talk about this more in detail. I don't know if you want to do that now, wait until later.
Yeah, we can do that later. So let's mark these as in progress and we can talk about it afterwards. Provision capacity reporting for generic topology design.
So I'm working on a proposal for this. I currently have a rough draft, and I think there's still some outstanding items that I need to sort out first before I can open a PR for it.
Okay.
But I'm thinking, yeah, this quarter it will just be design.
Cool. Sounds good. Next up is block volume support in Kubernetes to beta. So Brad Childs and Matt Wong were working on this. It sounds like last status PRs were out that needed API review. Brad or Matt, any updates on this?
We still need the review.
Okay. All right, cool. Next up, sorry, what's that?
I was going to say we need to go to the architecture call, I think, and ask someone to come and review this for us.
Yeah,
right?
that's like 2 hours from now, so that would be useful.
Okay.
I think they've got like a tracking board now that you can get on that'll help with that.
Okay.
Next up is the CSI external provisioner scalability issues. So Matt Wong's been working on this extensively. He had a bunch of PRs. I think most of them are merged now. Any update on this, Brad?
No, it's still in progress, but it's getting close.
Cool. So lots of good work going on there. Topology dynamic provisioning to beta. So last update requires all cloud provider plugins to implement and test first. So we were waiting on that. AWS was in, GCE needed end-to-end tests.
Yeah, so GCE is currently in progress. I think within the next week we should have GCE in as well. And then I think some guys from Azure are working on the same thing in parallel.
Okay, sounds good. And we have a question in the group chat. Background question: does CSI reaching GA in Kubernetes require the CSI spec 1.0 to be finalized? That's my goal, is that we also push CSI spec to 1.0 at the same time. For what I don't want to do is couple too many things as we do the push to GA for Kubernetes CSI. I think at least the spec definitely needs to go to 1.0, but things like block volume support don't need to go to GA at the same time. What I plan to do is basically decouple the core CSI APIs that we have and the additional functionality we're adding on top of it, so that we can move these components independently. We can GA the core CSI code and APIs, and then the features that we're adding on top of that, like block volume, can move at their own independent pace. Next up is evaluating a generic option for environment variable expansion. So I think it turned out there was going to be, actually, no, this is a different feature. Michelle, do you want to talk about this?
Yeah, so I think we just need someone to take ownership of this feature. I think Jordan actually had a few suggestions on some API changes that we could do to make this. So I think it's just someone has to take ownership, evaluate those API options, and then make the API change.
Do you want to sell this to people who might be on the sidelines watching as to why this is important?
This is basically, let's see, what is this one? Evaluate generic option for. Oh, this is this is a little different. I've been talking specifically about the subpath expansion. I guess this generic issue is different. I think.
Are we still pursuing this, considering we're trying to change the subpath feature?
Are we trying to change the subpath feature?
I thought the there was a security issue or something with the subpath expansion.
No, there's no security issue.
Oh, okay. The templating thing that we did, there was no issue with that?
No, there was no issue.
Okay.
The main issue was API backwards compatibility.
I see. Okay. So now we're just trying to promote that to environment variables.
As part of the subpath expansion, the node team just kind of brought up a concern, like if we're gonna special case this, is it feasible to like have some sort of generic mechanism? And if not, then we should sort of identify the reasons why.
Got it. So if anybody's using that feature for the volume side and you wanted to have feature parity, please step up and help with this. Next up is, so this is what I was talking about, I think, rollback environment variable expansion. Is this something we are not pursuing, or?
No, I think so. It's because the alpha feature, it turns out, has an API breaking change, then we need to roll that back.
Okay.
And consider a different design.
Okay. So if we're doing that, then 19 would be that design.
Yeah. Basically, if someone wants to take ownership of this, come up with a design,
Otherwise, this is
an
getting
alternative design, then we can go with the alternative design. Otherwise, we probably should roll back the feature.
Okay, cool. And John, do you have any updates on the rollback of this feature?
No, hopefully I'm gonna look at that next week, but it sounds like maybe I need to sync up a little bit with either you or Michelle to make sure I'm on the same page here. So.
Cool, sounds good. CSI driver, we're going to skip over that. CSI library for iSCSI common. Any updates on this, John?
Yeah, so I've got the first round of that working for single volumes or single path volumes. I'm hoping to get multi-path finished and get things under review here today or tomorrow morning.
Do you have a GitHub link for that?
Sorry,
do you have a repository link?
It's in my GitHub under CSI-connectors.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Sure.
It's just Jay Griffith, right?
Yep.
All right, cool. Next up is inline volume support for CSI drivers. This is also currently in progress, and I think Vlad has been taking over the design from Jan. Vlad, do you want to talk about this?
Yeah, sure. So it is, like you said, and it's in progress. So a lot of discussion on that proposal going on back and forth. Mainly the discussion was whether we should do this using existing storage PVC mechanism, or actually come up with changes to the API to support direct inline specification right in the pod. It looks like, I'm hoping that we have closure on that, and Tim gives us his blessing sooner than later. But it looks like we're going to go into the original direction, which is to introduce new API types to support direct embedding of the volume inside the spec, inside a pod spec for CSI. So that's what we're hoping for. And that's also the direction I've already started a PR, unless somebody comes back and say, no. The PR is already moving in that direction, starting to put in place the types to support this.
Awesome. Cool. Thanks, Vlad.
Sure.
Next up is passing workload information on to the node publish call. This is something that Jan's been working on. There was a proposal out, and it was dependent on the CSI driver registrar to pass in a bit that says that this is required. Jan has updated his PR to speak to that. Anything else you want to add, Jan?
No.
Okay.
Pretty straightforward.
Cool. Did we have a feature repo bug for this one? We could clarify.
I don't remember.
Okay, we'll clarify that offline.
For which one? 23 or 24?
For 24.
Oh, 24. Don't remember seeing one. I'm not sure.
Okay. We can look into that. Next up is dynamic max volume per count to beta. So Hemant, do you want to talk about this?
Yeah, I have updated the proposal for this one, and I have like most of the code written. Actually, I'll open a PR by tomorrow, hopefully.
Awesome. Next up is CSI entry, adding support for dynamic max volume per count.
Yeah, same. The PR will cover both of these actually.
Cool.
And the proposal also covers CSI pieces.
Okay. And then add volume usage capacity metrics was already completed. Then we have dynamic max capacity per plugin per node count. Any update on that one?
I have a proposal. It'll be similar to this thing. I'll open it, but hopefully tomorrow or Monday. Then, yeah.
Okay.
The one question is that do we want to do something like this in CSI as well? Because we did this for the attach count. We might have to make a modification in CSI spec, but we can target that in the next release for CSI.
Yeah, I think for this quarter, let's get it into Kubernetes, and then next quarter we can look at it for CSI.
Yeah.
But yeah, ideally we want the feature parity. Cool. Next up is CSI Spec, adding support for volume expansion. I know you've been working tirelessly on this, and it's looking closer than ever. Do you want to give an update?
Yeah, I think we had a call on Tuesday or Monday, and then we have we have the specs nailed down. I need to update a little bit the latest commit, and we should have this done.
Cool. Next up, CSI driver, we're going to skip over that. In-tree plugin Azure Disk update to support topology framework. Deep or Ping Fei, do you have an update on this?
Yeah, I can give an update. So it's pretty much as Michelle said, Ping Fei is from Azure, and he has been doing most of the work. Michelle and I reviewed his changes, and they look good so far. So it's basically in.
So status is PR and review. Awesome. So we'll mark that started. Azure file, we determined doesn't need these changes. AWS was completed. GCEPD, it sounds like that.
Started. I should have a PR out by today, later in the day.
Awesome. Okay. CSI drivers, we're going to skip over. CSI library, CIFS common library. So last status was agreement to move forward. Primary consumer would be Azure file.
I don't have an update on this.
Okay.
I was really waiting to see where the NFS is heading and kind of piggyback on it.
Yeah. So what we could do is just scratch it for this quarter.
Okay.
And see how NFS lands, and then based on that, come up with a.
Sounds good.
All right. Next up is finalizing on the migration story for the in-tree volume plugins. The last outstanding item was inline volume mapping, which is current. That design is currently outstanding. I don't know if David's on the line. It doesn't look like he is, but I don't believe there's been any further progress there. I was talking to somebody from AWS, and they're interested in helping with this. So I'm going to connect them with David, and hopefully they can help out with especially the implementation. Skip over the drivers. Next up is containerized kubelet issues. Brad and Brian Goff were going to help out with this. Brad, any updates?
I don't have an update.
Okay. Brian Goff was going to be the owner for this, right?
Yeah. When we talked about this a long time ago, he spoke up.
Okay.
But I haven't seen him on these calls.
I see. Okay, we'll leave that outstanding for now. Next up is GC driver. We're going to ignore that. External provisioner topology support for Kubernetes to CSI. Cheng, are you on the line by any chance?
Yeah, so I was able to get a prototype that's more or less feature complete. I'll be able to start flushing out the code for at least the Cubelet side before code freeze deadline as soon as possible, probably later today or tomorrow.
Awesome. Good work, Cheng. Next up is the Fibre channel common library. I think, Brad, would you be okay if we just punt this to 112?
We can, but we have someone working on it.
Oh, great. Is it woman?
It's Methusen. We have another intern that's started working on this.
Could you put their name in here?
Yes.
Cool. So in progress.
And Brad, do you want to introduce me or hook me up with that person, and we can see about building them in the same connectors library?
I would love that.
Cool.
Hey, John, I think your repository isn't public, by the way.
Oh, sorry. I think you're right. Hold on. You are correct, sir. Hold on a second. I'll fix that. Thanks.
All right. Next up is how to test Fibre channel iSCSI NFS libraries. Brad and Ben, I think you guys were going to take a look at that. Any updates on it?
Yes, actually, we have a call tomorrow to bring some efforts together. This is also something Methusen's done.
Cool. So as far as finding a home for this, I think Kubernetes CSI makes sense. Let me know when you guys want to open that. I no longer have permissions to arbitrarily create new repos and delete them. CNCF and Kubernetes admin stepped in and enabled all their automation and stuff, so we have to go and create an issue to create new repos. So let me know when you want to do that. Preferably give it like a few days head start, and because I think the turnaround time is a few days.
Okay.
Do that.
So just to clarify, is the goal for the in-tree drivers that are there for iSCSI and NFS to live forever, or should they eventually be replaced with out-of-tree CSI drivers?
So, good question. I think that depends on how much of the functionality ends up getting moved into these common libraries. If we discover that the majority of the functionality is moved into the libraries and the drivers that we have are essentially not very useful standalone, then we can eliminate the drivers and leave it to third parties to implement them using the libraries that we have. If we discover that the core libraries are useful to folks, but also the stripped down basic version of the drivers are also usable to some subset of the population, then we might want to keep both. I'm kind of going to lean on you guys, John, Griffith, Brad, Ben, to help make that decision. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I guess so. We'll probably bring it up a little bit more later when we get to the Windows item on the agenda. Thanks.
Cool. Sounds good. Next up is delete the iSCSI devices on unmount. That's been completed. CSI driver update. We're going to skip that. CSI NFS library. Ben, updates on this one? I think it was most likely we don't need it. Do we have a confirmation one way or the other? Oh, it looks like Ben's not on the call. We'll follow up with that next time. Host path volume reconstruction. I don't think I've seen any progress on this either. And I think the last status was that ideally we don't want this. We just want to go with a new checkpointing code, which also has not moved. Next up is flex volume resizing support. Aniket, are you on the line?
Yes, I am. So I recently, the PR about admission controller for volume expansion that just went in a few days ago, that had inadvertently excluded flex volumes on the controller from expansion altogether. So I had to rework my, I had to rebase and rework a little bit of my code to make sure that on the controller, flex volume still allows the expansion request to go in and finally percolate down to the actual kubelet level. So I have done that, and right now writing the E2E test. To raise the PR. That's what delayed me a little bit.
Okay. I think we still have enough time, so that sounds good to me.
Yep. Sure.
Next up is online volume expansion moving to beta. I believe Matt Wong and Hemant were working on this. Is it still on track? Hemant, Matt, or Brad, any of you have an update on this?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I haven't started, but still playing. Yeah.
Okay. And node shutdown. Status on this was it was in review. I haven't had a chance to look at it. I'm not sure if anybody else has. If not, we'll leave this and get a status update offline. Okay, next up is mount namespace propagation to beta. I believe there is a PR already out for this. Is that correct, Brad?
Yes. Yes, there is. Matthew's owning, wait, Matthew or Fabio?
I think it was Fabio.
Fabio, yep.
Cool. Sounds good, thank you. And then finally, replace volume reconstruction with checkpoint that we already talked about and move to the bottom. Okay, so we're done with the status review. We've got 15 minutes left. Next up is PRs that need attention. So promoting mount propagation to GA, which we just talked about. PR is available and needs review. Jan, is there something you wanted to talk about?
The PR itself is okay, but I would like to announce that we are going to move on propagation to GA. So if you have any issues with that, you should fill issues very quickly.
For those of you who are not familiar with the feature, this enables mounts inside of a pod instead of being in a separate namespace to share a namespace with the host. The benefit of that is that any mounts that happen inside the container are then propagated out to the host machine so that we can containerize our mounting libraries, which is critical for writing CSI drivers. So we're trying to get this promoted to GA so that CSI can depend on it. Next up is bugs to discuss that need attention. Looks like we have one here, enable flex volume driver to provide metrics. Anybody want to talk about this?
Yeah, this is Srini. Basically, we find the need to support metrics on flex volumes, and currently flex volumes doesn't support metrics. So by introducing a flag, a capability flag, see if metrics, if the driver supports metrics, then we would enable the FStats plugin. So that's the idea. Decided to, I don't know whether it is going to be a feature or, I mean, basically enabling it would be a bug or, but
This definitely looks like a feature because it's extending the Flex API. In general, the rule of thumb for Flex has been we're not going to continue to add to it. We're going to maintain the API as is and add more functionality to CSI. The reason for that is to try to not spread ourselves too thin by trying to maintain two different APIs. Since this is a feature change, it's something that we would need to declare at the beginning of a quarter as a feature issue before we accept it. So maybe it's worth having this discussion at the end of this call about whether we want to do this or not.
Sure.
We
Yeah.
can do it now. what do folks on the call think?
Go for
Well, I've said before that, you know, as long as we add features to both, we continue to have both. So the sooner we stop doing that, the sooner we move on.
Yeah, I think that's definitely my opinion as well.
So the one thing is that Flex is also used for like ephemeral storage sometimes, like the.
Yes, but we want to make CSI capable of doing ephemeral. We're doing a lot of work this quarter to enable that.
Okay, so the thing is like the matrix when we emit, like we might want to say that because if it's ephemeral storage, then it might the statfs call might not work actually, and you might have to use du or something. I just want to make sure that the same flexibility that other plugins have is available to Flex maybe. Just a quick feedback looking at the change, but I think we should go for it as well. I don't know. Yeah.
So I have a question. Beside ephemeral, is there anything else that CSI doesn't have right now that Flex has? So we'll know what to expect.
Workload information, but we have PRs in progress for everything.
Okay.
Yeah, I think we're working very quickly to try to close the gaps between CSI and Flex. This seems simple enough that it might be okay to accept this, but I think it's more of a principled stance of if we accept this, where are we going to draw the line? If we continue to add one more feature, we end up in this loop where we're going to continuously extend the Flex API, potentially introduce breaking changes at some point, and be on the hook for fixing those. So I would really, really prefer to pause development on Flex, keep it in its current state, fix bugs on it if there are any, and invest any future efforts towards CSI. So the person who proposed this, have you looked into CSI at all, or?
Actually, no. But the thing is, we are the requirement is basically coming from the field. People who are working on that are not in the call today, but that's the reason why we thought that interim. We understand that this is an interim fix, so kind of.
Do you have like a sales pitch on why you guys need this? But I think if we're right on the brink here, right? If you could sell us one way or the other, I think it might help.
I don't have the full context, so I'm pitching in for a person who is not available today. But that's the whole reason why they wanted this. Metrics is not available today, and they need that support. So.
Okay, maybe we can have this discussion again when the folks who are driving this are available.
Definitely. I can bring it up next week or next time.
Sounds good. Thank you. Next up are design reviews. So we have two. One is Windows support, and the second is conformance update. So Windows support, Patrick Lang.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, so we've been working on adding the Windows support to Kubernetes over roughly the last 2 years. And if there's actually a second link in the document there, I could share the screen if you'd prefer, or you could just click it. It's
I'll
up
go
to
ahead
you.
and stop sharing.
Okay. Okay. Okay, are you able to see that?
Yep.
Okay, excellent. So basically what we're doing is we're proposing to move the Windows Server support to GA, hopefully in 12. If we're not able to get all the tests passing consistently in 12, then they'll likely go into 13. But basically, I've mostly been working with SIG Node on this, but what I wanted to do was sort of vet this release criteria with SIG Node, SIG Networking, SIG Storage, and SIG Architecture. so that way we can sort of reach a community consensus on when Windows can graduate into GA. And so I don't have enough time to go over all points of this proposal right now, but the main thing I'm looking for is who I could work with in this SIG to sort of review these criteria, get feedback in there, and then what I'd like to do is send the final version of this document to each of the SIGs I mentioned for kind of like a final act of, yes, we reviewed this and we agree that once the criteria are met, we'll support Windows for GA.
So I think for initial pass of it, Deep has been doing a lot of the Windows integration work with us. Deep, would you be interested in helping with that?
Sure. I think the main item is mainly around flex volume for SMB and ICE, because I already reviewed the doc a couple of times. So I think that's what we are proposing for the Windows GA plan, right, Patrick? And
yeah,
I think that should be okay for now. It's a reasonable plan. And I think going forward in 1.13, I think that's when we need to think about like how CSI integrates with Windows and what are some of the subtleties there.
Okay.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
if you think that it's mostly there, what we could do is set up a separate call with SIG Storage where you could present this design and we could do a design review for SIG Storage.
So you're looking for a design review of the flex volume stuff, or
any of the changes that are storage related, essentially.
Okay. Yeah, I mean the majority of the changes are already in. The main things that are sort of lacking in our release process is making sure that the Windows tests are available on Test Grid, and I'm expecting to have that going in the next few weeks. And then, of course, making sure that we get to the conformance there. I think that some of the non-conformance tests still, in particular, have a lot of coverage that is covering basically POSIX and Linux-only features. And so, we will need to do some scrubbing there on how those are handled, just because, the Windows file system doesn't use UID and GID for Windows processes.
Yeah, that was unfortunate that leaked into the API.
Yeah. Likewise, I think there's a few things in CSI that we may want to, sort of clarify. Like one example is that there's currently language in there that says must use Unix sockets. And I think we probably want to change that to something like must use a authenticated IPC mechanism or something like that to just clarify that, on Windows we'll use name pipes instead of Unix domain sockets. So I'll sync with Deep on some of the CSI stuff, but given that CSI is not GA right now, I believe that our customers would be okay using the flex volume plugins that are there. And so, we've got those reference ones that are available on GitHub, and we've had some of the storage vendors looking at those as a starting point as well, because they could amend it and either, make I'm forgetting the name, but basically they could use a standards-based storage administration for their network devices, or things like cloud provider specific calls, like in the case of Azure File. So
we are hoping to drive CSI to 1.0 next quarter. If we could get the work done to evaluate it for Windows and get any of the proposals in this quarter, I think that would go a long way to ensuring that it doesn't last minute.
Okay. All right, so sounds good. And I'll sync with Deep and then circulate the final version after his feedback back to the SIG mailing list. So,
awesome.
Any other questions right now, or should we move on?
I think it looks good to me. If you feel the need to have a more extensive review, feel free, let me know, and we can schedule that. Otherwise, folks on this call, feel free to take a look at Patrick's document and provide feedback.
So I was curious about one aspect. Are you looking for explicit approval from every SIG? I was not quite sure of that.
Yes, I am, as well as SIG architecture. Because this impacts multiple SIGs. If there's, basically what I'm looking for is I want to make sure that I've got lazy consensus from each SIG, and and that someone has, reviewed and provided feedback on behalf of that. So that's what I'm looking to basically close up in that email to, give everybody a time period to say, here's the final version. Are there any last minute feedback objections? No. Okay, it's closed, and then we'll execute on that. And then when the tests are passing, we declare GA. So thanks.
Makes sense. All right. Thanks, Patrick. Next up, we have conformance tests by Michelle. We've got a minute left in the call. Michelle, what do you think? Do you want to talk about it now, or?
Yeah, I can totally cover it in a minute. So basically, I discussed a little bit with Brian, and he's actually thinking that we don't want a storage-specific conformance profile suite. Instead, he's pushing to have multiple features built into this conformance profile. So not just storage, but also include some networking stuff and maybe some RBAC and authentication things as well. So I need to work with Brian and maybe William on how to drive a conformance profile suite that is sort of cross SIG. And then at the same time, I'm also just focusing at our basically on our storage tests, how we might need to refactor our storage tests in order to eventually fit into this profile. And that's all the update I have.
Cool, that makes sense. I think to summarize it as I understand it, it's basically having more a end user focus on the tests, it sounds like.
Yeah, that's right. Like focus on some user functionality in terms of like, I don't know, packaging of like a bunch of features together.
Mm-hmm.
And then, so separately, we can still work towards having like some sort of volume profile qualification suite that we can do just for like all the volume plugins. But I think that's going to be independent of the conformance effort.
Yep, that makes sense. Anybody have feedback on that? Okay, if you have any feedback offline or you're interested, please take a look at the proposal that Michelle has and provide feedback there. That's all that we have on the agenda today. Is there anything anybody wants to talk about? Anything else?
There's a design review for cloning. I have an appointment that came up, so I can't have it today, but it'll be tomorrow. Try to finish that out. And we tried to break that down into a very small piece of it instead of trying to tackle transferring and populating. So I'm hoping we can close out after that meeting.
Cool. So cloning design review is tomorrow. You should have a invite because it gets shared out to SIG Storage. If you're interested, please attend that. And that's it. Anything else?
One thing real quick, just to get people to think about. So I've been playing around with iSCSI stuff a lot lately. So we've got a lot of things going on with iSCSI and Kubernetes. So there's the external target driver, or internal right now in an incubator, right, that we want to move out. So that's something that's on my list. There's also the built-in code in tree to do management of pre-provisioned iSCSI volumes as well, right? So at some point, I think we should kind of figure out where we want to consolidate, if we want to consolidate, if we want to continue to have all the 3 different options, or what. So just something to kind of think about, and maybe in the next couple of weeks, set aside some time to talk about it if people have thoughts on it.
Yeah, makes sense. I think the way that I see it, once we have a lot of this code isolated into a library, then the entry code could, the entry Kubernetes code could actually pull in that library and use it as well.
Okay, cool. Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. There's some compatibility things we'd need to kind of talk through and figure out. But yeah, that sounds good.
Cool. Anything else?
Saad, this is Sandy. I have one last question. I think we met once and you also indicated that you wanted some refactoring of the Auditory provisioner into more of a library structure. Is that something you still want?
It is something that's actually currently pending.
Okay.
So if you take a look at the work that John Griffith and John, who's working on the iSCSI one? Is that you?
Yeah, so I'm doing the iSCSI one. There's a couple of people looking at the Fibre channel stuff.
Yeah, I'm just talking about the general framework that you had mentioned that somebody did for Flex originally, and then you were using it in CSI, and you are indicating you want to get that refactored so it could be better used with CSI. So I don't know if that was, I don't have the specifics, but I think we're interested in helping if there's a work item around that as well.
So yeah, go ahead.
That's all I have.
Okay. For this quarter, the tasks that we had were to try to come up with generic libraries for these common drivers that we have.
Sure.
And the reason for that was that what we realized is a lot of the common code for these drivers like iSCSI and NFS are pretty much standard, but things like provisioning are going to be custom for a lot of different implementations depending on who's consuming it. So instead of trying to come up with a single driver that's going to make everyone happy, we want to pull out that core code into a library that others can consume and write their own CSI drivers on top of. And then maybe we also provide a standard driver, a basic driver onto, using that as well.
Okay.
So that's the initial pass we're doing. If you're interested in helping with any of these efforts, look for these common library items in the task list. Reach out to the folks that are leading that effort, and they would be happy to have your help.
All right. Thanks a lot.
Is there already a GitHub repo where this work is happening?
It's going to be created soon, so
okay, got it.
Out to John Griffith, he can tell you about that.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, and actually, if you want to check, so right now I have the CSI connectors repo that will someday move somewhere more formal. Right now, it just has the iSCSI stuff in it. The idea would be add Fibre channel, add whatever other things, and then also figure out how to implement the Windows side or anything else like that. So,
yeah, I imagine it'll be under Kubernetes-CSI/CSI connectors. We'll probably open up an issue to get that repo created in the next few days.
Cool. Yeah, and then we'll just fork into it. Sounds good. Yep. In the meantime, if you guys have, if you guys want to chat about it, anybody on the call that's interested, shoot me a note. Either find me on Slack or send me an email.
All right. Anything else? Okay, then we'll reconvene in 2 weeks. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care.